Hello, my friends. Welcome to Lindy's Magpie Reads. This is a place where I talk about books. I finished reading 6 great books recently, and I'm going to tell you about those in just a minute. But I also want to tell you about a little bit of other things that's been going on, like this fantastic opera that we went to last week called Ainadamar. So it's by an Argentinian composer, Golijov, and it's set partly in Spain during the Civil War and partly in Uruguay about 30 or 40 years later, where an actress is remembering Federico Lorca and his death, basically. But she keeps performing a play that Lorca wrote about Mariana Pinero, and the opera has got flamenco in it and really heart-rending scenes of the terrible things that happened during the war. Oh, loved it. And another thing I love is all the flowers that have started blooming. Oh, it's amazing. It's the end of February. It's pretty chilly. It's about 2 degrees right now, I think. But so many of those early flowers are showing their pretty faces, and I am going to include some footage at the very end of this video if you want to see that. And next I'm going to tell you about a book that I did not read, the Alphabetical Diaries by the Canadian author Sheila Heti. I know that I love her writing. I read Motherhood and Pure Color, thoroughly enjoyed them. So I thought, I got to give this one a try. And I do like it, but it's not the right time for me to read it, and sometimes that happens. There's a waiting list at the library, so I'm going to send it back and get it out again when I'm ready for it. But I have to tell you about it. Sheila Heti used sentences from her diary to put this novel together. So she had about 500,000 words, she said, and put them into a spreadsheet that alphabetized the sentences, and then chose sentences in alphabetical order, narrowed down to 50,000 words, 50 or 60,000 words, but made a story out of that. That kind of restriction that an author gives herself, I think it can really work or not. It can just be more like a curiosity. But it did make me think about, for example, what Georges Perec did with Avoid, and wrote an entire novel without using the letter E. And Jez Burrows, he put together a book using example sentences from dictionaries. I think short stories he created just using example sentences from various dictionaries. Well, it's a feat, but does it make a good story? I just have to read you one section so you can get a feel for it, because every sentence is alphabetical, and yet there is something compelling. They're put together so well. How much I enjoy pleasure. How much pleasure there is in just sitting around, writing, eating, and reading. How nice it is to contemplate new things for a change, and how good it would be to do that every day, just as last night we contemplated the stars. Another day it could be a tree. How many experiences are available to us in the nearest vicinity that we do not grasp hold of, let alone all those experiences at a further distance. How nice it is to have all these lovers, whatever happens with them. How nice it would be if one could actually rely on them. How random life is. How strange if all this was just to end in me finally returning to Pavel. How strange, as someone would say, of a dream. How stupid to go from such happiness one day to feeling such revulsion for oneself the next. From one day feeling joy to there being no possibility of it at all the next. How tiresome it is getting older. Yeah, Sheila Heti is a marvel. So, on to the 6 books that I did finish. Starting with a middle grade nonfiction called The Antiracist Kitchen. It's subtotaled 21 stories and recipes, and it's edited by Nadia L Hohn, illustrated by Roza Nozari. Just flip through so you can see the illustrations. There's photographs also of the 21 different authors. And I love how this book gives language to kids to talk about the experiences that they're having with racism and connecting food with culture and tradition and what a comfort it can be. There are some queer authors in here, both Canadian and American. It's published by Orca, an independent Canadian publisher that's located right here in Victoria, BC. One of the authors, for example, is Dane Zaa. He wrote the Adventures of Salma series that I've talked about on my channel before. That's an early reader series of chapter books. And his topic is Muhamara and what happens if you take all the spices out of it. Another queer author is Andrea Rogers, who is Cherokee. I've talked about her book Man-Made Monsters before. That's an adult collection of interconnected stories. And Wabgashug Rice, who is Anishinaabe, and he wrote Moon of the Crusted Snow and many other books as well. He's talking about a traditional food of his people, wild rice. And I learned that his family name used to be Manumini, which the colonial government changed, anglicized to the English meaning, rice. But now he has reclaimed the original family name for his children. Andrea Loney talks about a southern style of deviled eggs, and that leads me to the next book, which I listened to in audio. It's called National Dish: Around the World in Search of Food, History, and the Meaning of Home, and it's by Anya von Bremzen. She also wrote a cookbook that I read some years ago called Please to the Table, and in this book she is going from country to country exploring what foods are considered part of national identity, and she asks really good questions about how can a food that has been prepared over a vast geographical region be considered national, like who owns hummus, who owns lavash, who owns dolma. The deviled eggs connection is that when she's in Tokyo, she finds that there are little stores that cater to elderly Japanese who just need a small amount of prepared foods, and she found half boiled eggs individually packaged for purchase. There are fascinating glimpses like that into food culture around the world. In her section on Naples, where she talks about pizza and pasta, she has this to say: pasta had been manufactured in Naples since 1295, but it was in no way a dominant food group. A pain to produce and a lot more expensive than bread, it was prepared for the wealthy in fatty capon broth, way overcooked, and often served as dessert with sugar or honey or cinnamon, which it was like a light bulb went off in my head, because when I have visited my family in Slovakia, sometimes they serve pasta as a dessert as well. Freshly prepared noodles that have got sugar sprinkled, for example. All right, on to the next audiobook, which is historical fiction by two Mi'kmaq authors from Newfoundland and Labrador, Mi'sel Joe and Sheila O'Neill. And Sheila O'Neill reads the audiobook, and they base this on a true story. So back in 1822, William Carmack hired Sylvester Joe to be his guide across the island of Newfoundland, looking for the remaining Beothuk people. And this is a group of Indigenous people who were being shot on sight. And Sylvester Joe, who I think was a teenager at the time, around 17 or so, talked to his elders and agreed to lead this guy, but not to disclose the location of the Beothuk people. So this Scottish guy kept a journal recounting their trip across the wild of Newfoundland Island, and through it he kept referring to Sylvester Joe as my Indian. And in the novel, Sylvester calls him my white man, except he says it in Mi'kmaq, so when Cormac asks him what he's calling him, he says, "I'm just calling you boss." So it's the Indigenous perspective of that interaction with early explorers in Newfoundland. And it's really an all ages kind of story, suitable for elementary school all the way up to adults. Fascinating, actually. And there is a sequel out, Sulaway. So I will link information down below, actually, of all of these authors and titles that I'm talking about. You can find more information down below. My Indian is published by Breakwater Books, another independent Canadian press. And one more audiobook, Becoming a Matriarch, a memoir by Helen Knott. Her first memoir was called In My Own Moccasins, and it was very raw. This one has more polish, I guess I would say, but every bit as heartfelt. In this one, she talks about her mother and then her grandmother both dying within a fairly short period of time, and her feeling like she needed to step up and become one of the matriarchs of the family. At one point where she kind of breaks down from the pressure and tells her dad that she just can't take helping these men anymore, and he says to her, like, "Who asked you to?" Yeah, which good question. Yeah, the expectations that there are on women, and especially Indigenous women, of carrying the burden of caring for all of their families is really well described in here. Helen Knott is of mixed ancestry. She's Dane Zaa and Nehiyaw and European, and she's from the Fort St. John area of British Columbia. Next up is another memoir, and this one is by Randa, who's a Palestinian American, also queer. And I picked this up because my Lesbian Plus book club is going to be discussing it later today. We also discussed her first novel, A Map of Home. Randa is loud and proud about being a fat, femme, queer woman. This is a boisterous story that also talks about how abusive her father was. And there's a scene where after her parents have come to visit her, she's an adult with a grown son of her own, and her father has left behind an undershirt in the laundry room, and she takes out her feelings by spitting on it and stamping on it. Yeah, sometimes you just gotta do that. But she also writes about coming to terms with having a parent like that, and how as her father ages and he's got Parkinson's disease, how he's not the same man as he was then. And she's also recognizing the type of racism that he experienced in the US as well. This is one of the books that has so many serendipitous connections to other books that I've been reading. So, for example, she references a book by Leslie Marmon Sulko, who's a Laguna writer, and I have been reading one poem a day from this massive anthology of Native Nations poetry. And just recently I read the poem that she talks about, which is called Long Time Ago. She also talks about that sometimes people will try and open the emergency exit door on a plane just to make sure that it works. And like 2 days before I read that passage, I read a news story about an 18-year-old passenger from Victoria who was on a WestJet flight to Toronto, and the plane had to make an emergency landing because he was trying to open the exit door, which the airline assured people cannot be done while it's in flight. But anyway, why do people do this? And one last thing, she also talks about kleptomania. And that leads me to the final book that I have to talk about, The Collector's Stories. This is my favorite of all of the books that I've talked about so far today. The editor of this collection is A.S. King. She has won Prince Awards before. This collection of stories by 9 different fantastic writers, including A.S. King, also won a Prince Award this year. My YA book club talked about it just this past week. And it's one of those collections where I got something out of every story. It's very strong, certainly deserving of its award. The Prince Award is the most prestigious of the awards for young adult literature. Within here, there are a number of queer authors, including Anna Marie McLemore and E.E. Charlton Trujillo and Corey McCarthy, and David Levithan. David Levithan also wrote The Lover's Dictionary, which has the kind of parameters that it could fall into a category, something like Alphabetical Diaries. And that one is written for adults. Most of Levithan's books are for teens. This one is called Take It From Me, and his character in here starts stealing from other people's collections. He has so many rules, and the main one is it has to be the least valuable item of that collection. And yeah, so as you can imagine, things happen. And the final line is a good example of the way that YA literature can be every bit as literary and rich as literature that's written for adults. I said goodbye to all such things. And speaking of goodbye, it's that time now, so thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate hearing from you, so please say hello in the comments down below, and stick around if you want to see some pictures of the early flowers that are blooming in Victoria right now. Bye everybody, see you soon.